To begin.
Are you watching closely?
To begin.
Clytus, I'm bored.
How to start.
What plaything can you offer me today?
I made a weird decision while driving home from work. Yesterday. The time frame's not important, just that it came while I was just in the car and listening to a podcast about something else. By the way, hello. Welcome to The First Syllable. I am Professor Robert E.G. Black, and this is a podcast about writing. I treat this show as if these stories, the scripts, have been published, have been made into films, exist. This is notes for the future audience. You're all getting spoilers. Because maybe they'll never get published, and then this is just sort of thoughts about story structure, how things are put together. Welcome. I made a decision last year when I was deciding to do more detailed world building of my world Bas and my kingdom of Gardea. And there's other kingdoms around it I have some details for. And I wanted to expand it to use it as a homebrew world setting for D&D. And in doing so, I sort of jumped the time frame ahead by about 100 years from stories I'd written, and co-opted a D&D campaign I had run for 2.5, 3 years, I forget, that ended now a few years ago, or quite a few years ago. I believe it ended in 2019. And kind of takes some of that storyline and the homebrew stuff I had done there, because I had, if you know D&D, Forgotten Realms, Faerun, my game primarily took place in the Utter East, which is not technically Faerun. If Faerun is Europe, my game took place in like Turkey going down into, Lebanon, Israel, Egypt, and down into Africa or Zakhara. And I wanted to, because I left so much of what is 5th edition geography behind, I was making up most of my stuff on my own anyway. So I wanted to turn that homebrew world into this homebrew world. Combine them, twist them together. So I jumped the time frame ahead. And part of that was, there's a story I never finished writing. It was the last Gardea thing I was working on. It's called Song of Fellfaraway. And in it, Faraway Castle, which is the castle that is ruling over the kingdom of Gardea, it has been floating in the sky. That's where it was. There's a saying in Gardea, on a clear day, you can see Faraway Castle from anywhere in Gardea, or that essentially the words mean anywhere that Faraway Castle can see belongs to it. It's sort of the way they own much of Eliathea, the continent. Strictly speaking, because they exist on a spherical world, that's not true. It would have to be very high in the sky to be able to be seen from that far away, and it's not that high. It floats far enough above a mountain called No Top that it takes a while to get up there. So there is a sort of magical elevator from the bottom, but regular people can't use it. That's specifically for people from the town called Feeder Town, which is sort of the supply depot for stuff that has to go up to Faraway Castle. You don't need to know all that. Faraway Castle fell at some point. I hadn't written that story yet. I know the circumstances, but not necessarily the time frame. And so in making the new world building and jumping ahead in time a bit, advancing technology, advancing magic, advancing cultures, and twisting in the overthrow of the government of the city of Eadith that was in my homebrew world, and Eadith had been a city from Gardea that I had co-opted for my homebrew D&D campaign, and now was shifting it back the other direction. The thing I had set up was that Eadith became the capital when Faraway fell, because Faraway was beyond repair. It was abandoned. And at some point in that intervening time period, there was what they call the Prince's War, where Gardea wasn't really a kingdom anymore. It was this warring factions fighting against each other to take over, because King Comatas, who was the king in the first novel I wrote set in Gardea, after his death, his 9 sons fought over who got to be in charge. Not all of them took part in the fighting, but several did. And Gardea was sort of dismantled. And then I had this idea that as we jump forward a bit, people started referring to it as Old Gardea. And by the time it became a kingdom again, that got bastardized into Olgardea, Olgardea. But then as the world building got more detailed, the time frame changed a bit so that the time between Faraway falling and the quote-unquote present is only about 100 years. So they wouldn't lose track of the name. And so if they wanted to call it Old Gardea, interesting. But Old Gardea, that bastardization, abbreviation, whatever you want to call that, didn't work. In the car driving, and I don't remember what podcast was on or what they said that made me think of this, but I'm like, it shouldn't be called Old Gardea. And it doesn't need to be, and it's confusing, especially when I talk about stories in here where the other news. I was finishing the rewrite of the Escalor, story that used to be called the Escalor, now it's called Out of the Lion's Den and Into the Fire. It's a 31-page short story. That's 1-inch margins, 12-inch font, regular pages, 31 of those pages, that I did a rewrite of, and doing like half of it in one sitting, to update its world building, because it was the original Gardea story. And when I was writing it, Gardea didn't have a lot of detail. Gardea was an offshoot of a sort of real-world set of stories, and I didn't have a lot there yet. Details were building and building the more I wrote, but not like what I did last year where I set up cosmology and divinity, the list of gods, the moons, the cycles of the 3 moons, the calendar, the festivals, the races, for D&D purposes, the classes. And when writing in the novel Four Finger Discount back in December and January this past year, there was a lot more detail about the city of Edith as well. I invented a whole card game, well, most of a card game. I didn't want to invent it completely because I didn't want it to break down as not really working. I just needed enough to make it feel like a card game that works. It's called Three-Handed Mama, and they kind of play it it's one of the big steps of the heist for Four Finger Discount, is that they need to gamble a bunch of money and make sure a specific other player loses all of their money. Not that they have to win. They just have to make sure this one other player loses in order to set up a step in the heist they're going to do at the end of the book. So I needed a card game. And so there's a lot of more detail. So when I go back to rewriting the Escalor, it's not all humans in the town of Crail, though the town of Crail is primarily human, or, properly speaking, Haman. Though I've toyed with switching that to human just to be more basic about it. It is primarily parrowers, that is still the case. Parrower means they follow the god Parrow, formerly the man, gowl, Parrow, who is really the only god that people openly worship anymore. That's an ongoing bigger story. And in rewriting the story as I'm calling it Gardea, I'm like, so when is this set? I'm thinking about how it fits other things. And the version of the plot of the D&D campaign I ran a few years ago now is in this sort of legendary people who kind of saved the world from destruction called Reska's Riders. In the D&D campaign, it was Roscoe's Raiders. But I don't want to co-opt my players' characters. I just want to sort of in-joke for myself. I'm not going to tell the story of Reska's Riders, though they will get mentioned here and there. Four Finger Discount, one of the main characters is named Reska, after the legendary betrayer. Which is a fun D&D story, is that the player, Jared, he was moving out of state. And so we knew he was going to be leaving the campaign. The campaign was actually in its last legs. After he left, I think we only played for a couple more months to get to the end. But knowing that he was leaving, the plot of it was them dealing with these corrupted magical items, and as they traveled south to get to this certain point to save the world, one of the very bad magical items corrupted him, and we just went with it, and he fought against everyone. It was a great little day of the campaign when he was leaving, that he just got to fight everybody else. And almost win, as I remember it, because he had this particular magic item that was quite powerful. But as I'm rewriting the Escalor, I'm thinking, what happens to Journey when she gets older? We've already seen a glimpse of her in the first novel, which was called The Empress of Time. Quickly jumping in from editing, because this is a podcast for the future. I said that wrong. we get a brief cameo, unnamed, of Journey in Lion Horse Tree, not the Empress of Time. She is seen sitting at a table in the town of, I think, Basin Top, with her, well, spoilers, with a jar on the table that has red liquid in it. There's an animal in there. And I believe she has an eye patch, and she's older, so suggesting a lot has happened. Anyway, back to the ramble. The rewrite for it is probably going to be called A Stitch in Time, but I'm not sure. Because I'm playing on the idea of titles in Gardea being puns and sayings, idioms. Even Out of the Lion's Den and Into the Fire is an idiom in Gardea. 4-finger discount is a joke. 5-finger discount for theft. 4 fingers because, notably, our main character, Odds, is missing a finger. And that's kind of the setup for the plot. But I was thinking, what if Journey was one of Reska's riders? What if she ends up being exactly what she wants to be, and she goes and explores the world, and probably she would be what's called, how do you say it? I think it's Lowen? I think that's how I ended up spelling it. Lowen Wayfinder. Lao is a place off the coast of Eleuthea. The primary continent as far as the culture goes, and the main start to the stories, because that's where Gardea is. Lao, the people of Lao are quite peaceful. I sort of compare it in my mind to like Tibet or Nepal, up in the mountains, away from everyone else. But in particular, they have trained people that are wayfinders, which are the ones that have mapped the world. And I think Journey would become one of those, and so she'd be useful on a trip like with Reska's riders, where they had to leave Eleuthea and head. I guess they would have gone to the largest continent, Malastra, possibly to the large inland sea called Source. I think that's where they'd end up. Or maybe they'd go down into Karenbor. I don't know. I'm not going to really tell that story, though. I will add details to it here and there as they get mentioned. But I'm rambling. I finished the rewrite. I like it. It's 31 pages. I gotta read it and make sure it works, but mostly the changes were subtle things here and there, and then the biggest changes happened at the Festival of Mid-Spring Day because I wanted the dance to be more detailed. I wanted the 7 girls to be more interesting, dealing with like the races and more cultural details. Like one of them wearing a Baradonian face cage, which I see Baradonian as something like the equivalent of like Edwardian, a period of time named after a king. And in this case, when Baradon was king, things got very fancy and complicated, so his face gauge is like this jewelry thing that fits over your face, and she has a very elaborate clothing. This is part of adding a lot of world building and detail that doesn't need explanation, just gives you the idea of bigger things. But, yeah, the story works. So, I finished that rewrite. The next rewrite is probably going back to death, because I have this week, as I'm recording this, and next week of class, and then it's summer break, but I only get about 2 weeks of actual summer break, and then I have another class that's in the morning, but that means I get the afternoons to write. So, right away in those first 2 weeks, I think I'm going to go back to death, because if you've been listening to the show, I've figured out how to remove 5 whole characters, combine a few others, to give myself a little more leeway in the script for more character moments and beats before people start getting killed. I think it'll be a lot better that way. Then I hope to work on Chase 2 Rabbits, which is another Gardea novel that I've talked about in this show. Then maybe another rewrite once I get busy in the fall. I'll be doing some rewriting on other short stories that I wrote before, and novels like The Empress of Time, The Lion Horse Tree. That one is a problem because Lion Horse Tree is a joke of a title in the world, but it's not very obviously a joke out of the world. The Out of the Lion's Den and Into the Fire sounds like an idiom, even if we don't understand it. Lion Horse Tree doesn't sound like one, but I love that title. The other weird note before I get out of here is, last night out of nowhere, I had a very specific idea for. This was a story I already had the idea for, but I expected it to be well in the future. If I kept writing these things, I'd be like, oh, I'll do that. Because I've been saying I wanted to use the Gardea stories to toy with narrative structures. Like, Four Finger Discount is narrated by a character who was only in one chapter of the book. That we do find out a year or so later, he meets the characters again, and they told him this story, and so he's recounting it. The sequel to Four Finger Discount, if I get to it, has 3 narrators, none of which are the main character. On purpose. I don't want Odds to narrate the story. Because Odds is complicated and inside her head is really complicated. So I need other people to kind of see her from the outside. Chase Two Rabbits is a first-person narrator. It's a detective story, so like the fantasy equivalent of a hard-boiled detective telling the story. And because of Parrow being the only god that's really around anymore, also Lystra and Demes, but that's different. People don't worship her. They reference her, but they don't worship her. She's forever. She can't be forgotten. The other gods were forgotten. But I had this idea for an equivalent of the Gospels to, at some point, tell the story of Parrow. Because he is Jesus Christ if Jesus Christ were a violent revolutionary. And I was like, what is actually involved in that story? What happens? And I had this idea of telling it like the Gospels, where it's like 4 of his followers, the Hakeu, 4 of them, maybe 3. Maybe I'd only do 3. But there'd be references in the like footnotes, commentary about how some of the other Hakeu also wrote accounts of this story, but maybe didn't finish them, or parts of them were lost to time in the wars that followed. So you don't get bits and pieces of some of them, and 3 of them in entirety, and those 3 tell the story very differently. Like, there's this famous point where, before Parrow decides to become a god himself, essentially, he turned to each of the gods one at a time to try to get their help, and for some reason they wouldn't help him with this situation. Part of that situation is something I'd still have to figure out. But the idea I had yesterday out of nowhere was, well, what if the different people writing these Gospels, or the Godspells, had different reasons to focus on different gods he turned to? And so we only get parts of the story. It's like one of them is really excited about him turning to Baraket. One is really excited about him turning to Adeline. It's just weird that that story was in my head last night when I've been thinking about Chase Two Rabbits again recently. Figuring out some more details about the opening scene. I know what happens at the beginning. I know how we get into the story. I need to sit down with my 2 notes files for it. One's on the computer, one on my phone. And really just combine them and sort them like I did when I was about to write Four Finger Discount, as I used my different character notes and everything and put them in an order so I could have bullet points of how does the plot go. I don't want a detailed outline, but I need a general outline for a detective mystery. Essentially, he's hired by this rich guy to find his 2 daughters. They're not missing exactly, they're just distant. He just wants to make sure they're safe. But a detective poking into their lives sets a series of other events into play that messes with local organized crime, local power structures, the rich people of Aedith, the politicians of Aedith, and ties into a lot of other stuff going on that snowballs outward from just trying to find these 2 girls and make sure they're okay. And so I need an outline for that. So probably I'll be working on the outline while working on rewrites of other things. I'm going to leave it there. This episode got longer than I expected it to be. Update next week on whatever I'm working on.
You're still here? It's over.
Stuff that dreams are made of.
It's a passport
Go home.
to another world.
Go.